Hey guys, we are back with some more Deuce-to-Seven Triple Draw action from the streaming table of the 50k PPC. I'm in the money, but my stack is getting kind of short here, and I am hoping to do a little bit better on the stream table as we continue the orbit of Deuce-to-Seven Triple Draw, and I have a pretty interesting hand that I think covers some really common and key concepts in Triple Draw, so let's go ahead and take a look here. Seven-handed, so again, like pretty tight ranges all around. Ben Lamb's got piles of chips and no real concerns here and opens in the cutoff with 2-6-7, super standard. Maybe the hijack, I guess, still totally fine. And I have a hand in the big blind to defend. I have the Deuce-5. Now, this is the sort of combination that under extreme ICM pressure, I'm totally fine just folding. I mean, you don't have to draw 3 at these 2-card wheels. But for chips, it's also just an extremely easy call. And I'm kind of feeling like it's much, much closer to the latter scenario here. Not only do I have a relatively short stack, so I need to make chips, but there's very flat payout structures in the World Series. We're just inside the money, and I'm just trying to build back up my stack here and hope for the best. So this is a pretty standard defense. One thing I would note is that you can overdo it a little bit with your D3s in the big blind. Against early position raisers, you really want to make sure you only have like a deuce and a wheel card. You don't want to go too crazy here. But I do have the deuce and the wheel card, and I defend the Deuce-5. We'll pay a little bit of attention to the blockers here. Always remember what you throw away, guys. Queen Jack 9 here going in the muck. And we face a 3-2 situation here where I improve very significantly right away, and I am up against the D2 range from the hijack. So this is immediately an interesting spot, and we have a decision to make. So the first thing is I catch 9-7-6-5-2 in a 3 versus 2, and I'm thinking a couple things here. One, I'm going to be thinking about whether I'm going to be playing any leadouts in this spot. So, for example, maybe even with my 4-card hands, I would want to play some bets that are planning to draw 1 and charge my opponent when he is a card behind. In the 3 versus 2 spot on the first draw, it's not a spot where you're very far behind hot and cold equity-wise. That said, it is a spot where I have a much wider range than my opponent, particularly because he has a D2 range from the hijack, right? So it's not like he has some really rough range with some weaker holdings from the button, where I'd be more inclined to bet out. And also, my individual hand is a little bit of an interesting combination here. I'm not super interested in padding a 9 on the first draw here, I don't think. 3 versus 2, out of position against the tight range, with a 7 draw, I'm definitely hoping to do a little bit better here with 2 draws to go. I don't think I'd be a favorite against any hands that he would pat with here. Well, obviously I wouldn't be a favorite against any hands he would pat with here, but I don't even think I'd be a favorite against his range here, because he often is going to be drawing 1 here or pat. And so I plan to play this one really passively. I just decided to go with the check call and draw 1. And I think that's a very reasonable play when you're facing a tight range. When you're up against an early position range, and they're not necessarily even going to bet 100% unimproved, so if it goes 1-1 on the turn, you're sort of happy you kept the pot small. If it goes 1-2, you're not that far ahead. You're also going to have a lot of weak hands in the big blind that are going to want to go from 3-1. So overall, I think this is a spot where I will see players do a lot of different things here, but I think the straightforward play of play passively and break is my favorite option here. I think there are arguments for lead. Maybe you could say pat if your opponent doesn't raise and break if your opponent does raise. That will work quite well against very ABC opponents that will make your life easy on the later streets. That said, I do think it's a little bit of a waste of the 7-6-5-2 draw, and I do think that it is a little bit hard against higher stakes, tougher opponents where you wouldn't have an easy decision if you got raised on the turn. Probably you would want to call and break, but maybe against some very straightforward opponents you would almost just want to fold. So it's just kind of an awkward combo to play no matter how I slice it. I did start with a check. I figured I was just going to go ahead and check range here, given my shallow stack, given a little bit of ICM pressure, and just given the 3 versus 2 range situation. Obviously, Ben Lamb has a very easy bet here with a very premium draw, and I thought about all the options, but settled on the one that I already described to you guys, which is the simple call. And on the turn, again, we have a very interesting decision here. So now it goes 1-1. I recognize that my range is a little bit weak here, and I catch the dreaded 10. This is probably the most awkward card in the deck to catch, because I have a lot of incentive to stand pat with it, but it can get bad for me in a hurry, right? It's not that strong of a hand, but it does have a lot of equity when my opponent is still drawing 1. So how do we handle this situation? It's a common spot on the turn in triple draw. You make a weak made hand with a good underlying draw. Well, I feel pretty comfortable with the following plan. Check, break if my opponent bets, pat if my opponent checks behind. That is the way I typically approach this situation, and it leads to some awkwardness on the river, which we're going to see in this hand, but there's no great solution to this problem, because let's say you just decide to play a bet and kind of see where you're at in this sort of a hand, right? If you bet and get raised, you definitely need to break the hand. That's not really the main problem. The main problem is you are very susceptible to getting frozen. So a freeze play here would be if your opponent just calls your bet on the turn and then stands pat behind you. And he should do that with a lot of 8s, maybe even some 9s, and now you've completely wasted the equity of your underlying 7-6-5-2 draw, and he's gotten you to stand pat in a spot where now you have 0%. And that is going to happen at a decent frequency. It's also something that happens more often in tournaments than it does in cash, and in later stages, because people are playing cautiously even with their good 8s, they don't want to reopen the action. So you'll see a lot of freezes, and it's a reasonable play in this situation for my opponent. Obviously, we can see his hand doesn't make sense to do it with, but it is a good play. So I kind of want to avoid that. The more your opponents are capable of freeze plays, the worse it is to lead out with a hand like this and pat, and the better it is to just check and break it if they bet. I did a little bit of work on this spot here in StudFlopDraw, and we can just look at 2 different spots and 2 different sims. So the first one here is when it goes check on the turn, and I know for sure my opponent is drawing, right? So I gave my opponent top 20%, drawing 2, drawing 1, and then drawing 1 again. One line you're never going to see is your opponent checking behind on the turn and then standing pat behind you. That wouldn't make any sense. That would not be a good play from him. So this is a pretty straightforward, line here, and it makes sense. And we can see that my hand has 63% equity against that. It's very clear that we need to stand pat with this hand. Let's say that I also, if I had something like a jack and I just decide, well, I have a hand that's a small favorite against a pat, but I also have a hand that's good drawing. If we draw instead, and I throw away that 10, now we see I fall to 50% against his range. So now it's just a pure 50-50 spot, and I'm out of position. Typically in 1-1, out of position against anybody competent, you're going to lose a little bit of money on the river. You're going to have reverse implied odds because you're just out of position. You lose money in these flippy spots, and you have to check and do a lot of calling, and when you bet, you sometimes get raised, etc. Notice that if we just do a little bit of tinkering here with the range, and we make my hand a jack, let's see how much equity the jack has instead of the 10. Same situation, and it's basically 49%. Oh, that one wanted to throw it away. Let's force keep it, guys. Let's make it so that we keep this jack, and let's see how much equity we have here. Okay, so you are still a favorite, right? Patting the jack, but it's much less. It's only 55%. And now you have this other problem on the river, which is the one I actually suffered for in game, which is that you have a very capped range when it goes check on the turn, and then you stand pat. You mostly do have a hand that's a 10 or a jack. Every now and then you can have a whiff check raise, but in these later stages from the big blind in the tournament, I'm not going to have as many of those as I'm going to have like hands that are sort of like this, right? So you sometimes throw away a little bit of hot and cold equity for positive implied odds, and with 55% with the Jack 7, I would think that that's pretty close. I would feel a little bit more comfortable drawing with that hand. Maybe the 9s being dead helps you want to pat this, and if the 9s weren't dead, we'd have a little bit more equity. We'd have a little less equity with the Pat Jack 7. I'm not even sure, but I'm guessing it would be a little bit less, like 53, 52. Nevertheless, I do think that that's close, and I would probably rather take the plus implied odds of making the 7 low, rather than have to check and face a decision on the river when I always have a jack or a 10, and I'm basically just like crying calling against a range that I'm hoping finds enough bluffs. That's what ends up happening here, as it does go check on the turn. I do stand pat with the 10, which I think is definitely the right play. I have a little bit too much equity to throw away this caliber of hand after it goes check. And now, on the river, I definitely think we should always be checking here. This is a spot where if you ever did have a very, very good hand, you could probably even throw in some check raises from time to time, but primarily your range is super capped here, right? And in Solverland, whenever you have a completely capped defensive range, you play passively. So I'm going to check here, and then I'm going to make my opponent, make the decision whether to bluff or whether to value bet or whether to just check it behind. And unfortunately for me in this situation, you can see my stack size, guys. I have 340k left. We're playing 6120k. Of course, I'm hoping it goes check. I'm praying that it goes check. And instead, Ben Lamb bets. And now I have a 0 EV hand that can only beat a bluff, and I have to decide how likely it is that I can beat this bluff. Should I cry and call with this 10 low? So in this sort of situation, I think a few things when I'm playing live poker. One, I think this is kind of an underbluffed spot. If I had to give a player read on the population in general, I would say it's not a situation where people often try to bluff you off of a made hand. So even if they should sometimes find bluffs, and in this situation, he should probably find bluffs from small pairs and maybe hands like 9-9 if he ever has it. I guess it's really hard for him to have 9-9. 8-8 would maybe want to bluff, but I'm probably going to always call if I have a 9 in my hand, because I'm just not going to have that many 9s, and so when I have a 9 low, I'm going to feel like I'm way too high up in my range. So he's mostly going to want to bluff from small cards that unblock my roughest hands, and usually with pairs of 2s or 3s. I did call and draw 3 out of the big blind, so I don't. The 2 blocker might not be that meaningful for him. Those are the hands I'm hoping to catch a bluff from. One of the things I was thinking about in game here is that I probably thought I needed to call because I did throw away 2 9s earlier in the hand. Those would be cards that a good player could go for a thin value bet against me, considering my range is basically almost exclusively made up of 10s and jacks. I do think that if my opponent made a 9 low here, he could go for some thin value. So because I've thrown away 2 9s, it makes my opponent a little bit more what we call polarized. He's much more likely to have a very good hand or a bluff. Obviously, Ben Lamb has a very good hand here. Maybe he just always has a very good hand. That's a big problem for me. I did decide to call. I thought he was a tough enough player that I had good blockers to have seen earlier in the hand, and I felt a little too high up in my range, knowing that I would have some worse 10s and some jacks. Not that that matters all that much. All these spots are just very, very close marginal decisions. You can use whatever decision-making criteria makes sense to you in the moment here, whether that be a player read, card removal, vibes. I mean, there's really not much that's going to make this an easy spot no matter how you play it, so you're always playing a guessing game. I decided I needed to pay this one off. In retrospect, I somewhat regret it. I just think that people really underbluff this spot, and of course I was wishing that I never caught that 10 in the first place, which is an annoying card to catch, and of course I felt bad that my opponent ever bet the river, which would be very bad for me overall. And lose another one, guys. I'm down to 220k. It's looking pretty dicey for Donkey here to make a deep run in this 50k PPC. I'm in the money, but I'm really, really going to have to win the next hand I play, or I'm going to be out on, just barely inside the money here for a min cash. And that is, that's how this hand ended up in this triple draw round. So let me know what questions you have. I think this is a tough hand to play. I think there were a lot of decisions that are definitely close here, and I think it's going to lead to a lot of questions. So let's chat about it in the comments, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think about the hand. Thanks.